Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the Resilient Responder podcast. I'm your host, Ali Rothrock. Big thanks to Fire Engineering for giving me the opportunity to have this podcast and to share these stories with you. I'm really so excited. Today is going to be a bit of an intro about what we're going to be doing here at the Resilient Responder podcast, but we will also be featuring a guest and talking about an incident as well. I'm so glad you're here. Okay, so a little bit about me while we kick things off. So I joined the volunteer fire service 19 years ago, which is shocking. I've spent over half of my life in and around the emergency services, which just doesn't seem correct. But it has indeed been 19 years. I joined the volunteer fire service in 2005 when I was 16. And in those 19 years, my love for and investment in the emergency services community has only grown, and the ways that I've been able to educate myself on different things that affect first responders and then be able to come back and put that education back into the emergency services community is one of my favorite things to do. My husband is in the Air Force, and as such, we move a lot. We're in a season of moving a lot, and so we moved a bunch recently. We have 2 moves coming up next year. And so as such, I have not been able to find a volunteer firehouse home. But I have grand plans to do so once we stop moving and get settled. But even though even though we've been sort of back and forth and changing time zones and all of that, my investment in this community has only deepened. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share with you all a lot of the things that I've been learning as it relates to first responders' mental health. So I just graduated with my master's degree in trauma and resilience, and my coursework and my thesis, which I'll talk about later, all of that was focused on first responders' mental health. I'm a certified trauma responder with the Association of Traumatic Stress Specialists. Before that, I have been a domestic violence and sexual assault counselor. I did that important work both in domestic violence in a shelter and also in hospitals. I'm an author. I'm going to talk about my book After Trauma in a little bit. I'm also a CISM team member, and doing that crisis work for first responders is so important to me. And so, the gist is I spend a lot of time writing about, thinking about, teaching about, speaking about what it means to be resilient, sort of this thing that's hard to define and hard to quantify, both as responders, but also just as human beings. What does it mean to be a resilient person, both at work and at home? And so I first sort of came to this thought of first responders' mental health, our mental health being impacted by the job that we do, from my very first fire call. And if you've seen my TED Talk, or if you've read any of my books or seen me speak, you know that my first fire call was a bit of a doozy, as it turned out. Like I said, I was 16, so I was a child myself, but it ended up being a fatal car accident where a 5-year-old was killed. And I don't know if you remember your first fire call. I think most people's first calls are like nothing that exciting, except, you got the call. That's the exciting part. But for me, this call was incredibly memorable. And I remember standing there watching what was happening, because of course I had no training. I couldn't do anything but watch. I think I handed out rubber gloves at some point. But I remember thinking, okay, I understand the gravity of this. I understand what I'm seeing. When we get back to the firehouse, surely someone is going to say, okay, this was really tough. Here's what we can do to help ourselves. And that conversation never happened. And I continue to see that pattern over and over again in my emergency services career. And there was such a gap in emergency service specific mental health education that was actually like relevant and truly helpful. So much out there just missed the mark or wasn't there at all. And so in 2018, after spending a good decade, I would say, standing on stages talking about first responders' mental health, I founded an organization called On the Job and Off, which I've been running as the CEO now for 6 years. And it's an organization that's dedicated to helping first responders beyond the call by giving them the support that they deserve. We have 17 different online courses that I and other subject matter experts wrote specifically for different emergency service disciplines that cover topics like grief, post-traumatic stress, sleep, managing critical incident stress, suicide prevention, and so much more. And all of that is at onthejobandoff.com, which is also linked in the show notes. And then also as a part of on the job and off, I created something called the First Responder Assistance Program, or FRAP, which connects first responders directly to our FRAP clinicians who I trained to work with each specific discipline. So at present, FRAP serves fire, EMS, dispatch, law enforcement, corrections, and coroners. And so, sort of going beyond that immediate work, I am really passionate about documenting, highlighting, and preserving the stories that were made in moments of trauma and after, sort of this like humanity behind the headlines that we see on social media. If anyone actually reads a newspaper anymore, like those headlines that are terrible when something bad happens, we're all aware of it, right? Especially as first responders, we want to know what happened. But it's so important to tell those stories of the hardest things that happen. But there are other stories to tell too, the stories of what we do for each other in the midst of and after those hard things. I'm sure you've heard of the Mr. Rogers quote that he says, look for the helpers. You will always find the people who are helping. When something bad happens, look for those people. And those are the stories that I am so driven to immortalize, as they can tell us so much about ourselves. And so I think that the choices that our fellow humans have made in moments of crisis and after can greatly inform us about what it means to be resilient, both individually and collectively, both as first responders and just as people. And at the end of the day, I think what can help us to know that we're not alone if we are struggling is to perhaps learn from someone else you can relate to about what they went through and about what they used to get and to stay well. And as first responders, you see more trauma and chaos than most. And sometimes, in my work with first responders, I've seen this and I have felt this myself, where you just sort of feel like the world is all bad, or that bad things happen most of the time, which is not true. That's an availability bias that we have due to what our work requires us to witness. But it's not true that bad things happen usually or all the time. And that's another reason why I want to tell these stories, the stories of what comes after these bad things and the ways that we can all respond resiliently. And I hope that never in your career do you have to experience an incident like the ones that we're going to cover in this podcast. But if you do, I hope that this podcast can provide you with some hope and some direction in which to move forward. And I also want you to understand that even if you don't experience something like the Las Vegas shooting, which we're going to talk about today, but you maybe experience something like a really bad car accident or a fatal fire or a call that just makes you feel jostled, that experience is incredibly valid. And you never have to, it doesn't have to be like, quote, bad enough for it to be okay for you to feel like you need some support after. I have so much to say about post-traumatic stress and trauma recovery, what I've seen work personally, what I've seen help first responders and the trauma survivors that I've worked with, what the research and the data has shown us. And we're going to get into all of it throughout the life of this podcast. I mentioned that I just finished grad school. My thesis was exploring the mental health impacts of incidents of mass violence on first responders. And so in the course of researching and writing that paper, I was able to quantify those impacts, and I was able to really find what the data points to about maybe what sort of experience or what sort of factor, if it's present at an incident of mass violence, is directly correlated with higher rates of what we call a failure to recover from a traumatic event, or what could also be called as PTSD. But what I also found in researching that topic was just a lot of data and research that can help the day-to-day first responder that's just trying to make sure that they are set up for success when it comes to their mental health. And so we're going to get into all of that. I'm also someone who talks about PTSD from personal experience. I got that diagnosis in 2012, and it really, truly saved me. So when I talk about PTSD, I'm talking about it because I know what those depths felt like. And I know what that fight feels like when you are fighting to become a better version of yourself. And I'll tell that story someday for sure. But if you want to know more about it now, you can read my book, After Trauma, and the link to that is in the show notes. So this word resilience, sometimes I bring it up or people are like, oh, what are you researching? Like, what are you talking about? Or blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, resilience. And they're like, what even is that? Like, what even is that? And I get it. It's a hard thing to define. And this word has become popular and a bit of like a buzzword in the self-help community. And it can be confused with like never having a bad day or never letting things get you down or like having a stiff upper lip. But that's not it at all. Like, that's not it at all. Real resilience is not about numbing away or ignoring our stress reactions, but has to do with a concerted effort to know ourselves better so we can better meet stressors when they come with intentional action instead of dysregulated reaction. Resilience is about being a formidable yet flexible force that can evolve with change. It's about knowing that no matter what happens, our story continues on. So, in short, if I had to define it, I think that resilience is a series of choices made both in the moment and post adversity, choices bolstered by a deep resolve that life is still worth living to its fullest extent, and that in the end, we are simply so much bigger than anything bad that can happen to us. That's the takeaway that I want you to gain here. So, some of the incidents that we're going to cover in this podcast, by definition, are incidents of mass violence. So, by definition, they have someone who caused the incident. They have a perpetrator, a bad guy, right? So, in discussing those events, I'm going to be participating in something called the No Notoriety Media Protocol. And this is in accordance with the journalistic principle to minimize harm. So I'm choosing to participate in No Notoriety in an effort to reduce further acts of mass violence due to media-inspired fame. So No Notoriety was established by Tom and Karen, these parents of this boy, Alex, who was one of the victims of the 2012 Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting. And this organization calls on the media to eliminate the gratuitous use of the name and likeness of rampage mass killers and to shift the focus to victims, heroes, and survivors. So in the incidents that we cover, like in the Las Vegas shooting, which we're going to talk about today, and in all the other incidents that I have planned, and in the survivors that we talk to, we aren't going to spend time talking about the people who caused the situations that they survived. I'm not going to talk about them in the narrative that I write. I'm not going to mention their name, and we're only going to bring them up if the survivor does so as it's relevant to their story. My thinking is there's enough online about those people. If you're curious, quick Google search will give you a lot of information. But here we're going to be focusing on the survivors and the first responders and really what comes after. All right, so today we're going to be covering the 2017 Las Vegas shooting at the Route 91 Music Festival across the street from the Mandalay Bay. And we're going to be joined a little later by one of the dispatchers who was working that night. I have such a soft spot in my heart for dispatchers. I think they are so underappreciated, so underrecognized. And when I was working when on the job and off, we created our first sort of course menu. It was for firefighters because that's the world I know the most. And all of our courses are written for that perspective and with those examples. The very next full course menu that I wrote, like rewrote the courses, refilmed the courses, re-edited, re-uploaded, was for dispatchers. Because again, I think they are truly the first responder. And I am always going to bat to include them in first responder mental health coverage. So I'm really excited to be able to have a dispatcher on for our first episode. So we'll get to her in a little bit. So we're going to get into the incident a little bit, and I'm going to show you sort of what it looked like to be resilient in these moments of chaos and how it looks to show up for your fellow humans when it feels like the world is ending, as one survivor put it. So it was Sunday, October 1st, 2017. It was the third and final night of the Route 91 Music Festival in Vegas. It was around 10:05 p.m. and Jason Aldean had started singing. And as he did, he was sort of strumming his guitar away from the mic, did a little spin, walked up to the mic and got a couple lines in. And all of a sudden, rapid gunfire began. And in the cell phone footage I was watching, people are obviously filming him, filming the people. and they swing wide away, sort of in shock, and you just sort of see the Mandalay Bay come into focus. And you can hear the gunfire just really start to pick up. And a few seconds later, Jason Aldean ran off the stage, and people started to realize that something was really wrong. Like, this was not pyrotechnics. This was not planned. This was a problem. One of the survivors, Doris Huser, described the sound as firecrackers in a metal barrel. The bullets began to ricochet off of everything and through everyone, and people just began to run. They ducked behind trash cans. They tripped over each other as they ran. They jumped into dumpsters. They were diving behind barricades. I mean, this wasn't that long ago. I'm sure you remember hearing about this incident and maybe even seeing the images on social media, the videos on social media of just chaos. So on scene was the Clark County Fire Department, the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. There was on-site security, and community ambulance was who was providing EMS coverage for this concert. So as a part of the prep for the concert, all of those agencies that I just mentioned had discussed an active shooter scenario. And as a result of that preparation, they placed their main medical tent in such a place where ambulances would have easy access if on the off chance something happened and they just needed to load and go. So EMS crews had been walking around through the crowd, just seeing if anybody needed anything. And 3 different ambulances were staged in that staging area near the main medical tent. So after the first few seconds of gunfire, where everyone is trying to figure out, is that what I think it is? A police officer stated, "This is real." And then everything just sort of kicked off from an emergency response perspective. So Glenn Simpson is an AAMT. He was leading the special events division for the concert, and he ran into the medical tent, radioing for additional resources. Hospitals began to be notified, and it all just sort of started ramping up. So at Community Ambulance, an all-call notification was pushed out. Every single ambulance was staffed and responded to the site in less than 30 minutes. 4 off-duty community ambulance personnel were enjoying the concert, and as anyone would, quickly began to help their colleagues aid the injured and try to save the dying. In the medical tent, the bodies of the deceased had to be moved outside to make room for the living, and the medical personnel picked up discarded cowboy hats to place over the faces of the dead to indicate no medical treatment was necessary. So then crews learned that a Las Vegas Metro police officer was on the ground and wounded, and 2 EMS workers, along with police officers providing armed protection, raced out to find this police officer. At that time, several other police officers climbed up a 35-foot tower that was originally designed as sort of a watchtower over what used to be a parking lot, and they took positions with their long guns to protect and defend the medical tent from what they thought might be a ground assault by multiple individuals, because we now know, of course, that the gunfire was coming from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay up very high. But because of the way that the geography was, because of the different buildings, they had no idea, was there one shooter? Was there multiple shooters? Were there people on the ground? They just didn't know. As you can imagine, it's just chaos in those moments. So those cops climbed up that tower and were just trying to provide protection for people on the ground. A couple minutes after that, the medical tent lost power, but the EMS crews did not stop. In the dark, they worked to apply tourniquets and administer fluids, all while surrounded by armed police officers. Again, they assumed there were more shooters on the ground, but the people in front of them needed help, so they stayed. Las Vegas Boulevard became littered with the injured and the dying. Some were carried in the arms of strangers, others laid out on pieces of dismantled fence, some were shoved into wheelbarrows, makeshift tourniquets tied. Again, because this wasn't that long ago, and cell phones are what they are, everything was filmed. And so a quick search on YouTube or a quick Google search will show you these moments. And when we think about incidents like this, and we think about maybe things that happened a long time ago or ways that people act bravely during maybe like the Second World War, there's photographs of some of these things, but it's not filmed. And so we can witness these acts that people, just everyday people, perform to try to save their fellow human being. And I think that's a beautiful thing that we should document. Other injured were loaded up into back of civilian pickup trucks. They were shoved into Ubers, and dispatchers, as we'll hear a little bit later, just advised them how to stop bleeding, how to help control bleeding, and just to drive as fast as possible to the closest hospital. So by 11 p.m., less than 1 hour after the shooting began, all critical patients had been transported to the hospital. So that's remarkable. So roughly 50% of the shooting victims, 264 patients, were transported by ambulance to 13 different hospitals, and the rest were transported by other vehicles and bystanders and wheelbarrows. You can literally watch people hauling butt down the street, just holding somebody in a wheelbarrow, trying to get them to a hospital. So more than 100 ambulances responded to the scene, including 22 from a community ambulance. We had Clark County Fire Department, Las Vegas Fire Department, Henderson Fire Department, AMR and Medic West sent ambulances and personnel. I mean, you can imagine when something like this happens, and especially when an all call is announced, everybody comes. And I think just this response is an incredible act of resilience. It's an example of an emergency response system flexing to hold such a large demand of need and such a large response of resources and of individuals making resilient decisions in the midst of chaos. The community ambulance CEO, Rob Richardson, said, "These were unarmed medical personnel in polo shirts and pants, stayed while under heavy gunfire because they weren't willing to leave their patients. It's more than awesome. They have a heroism and human kindness that is second to none." So 31 victims were pronounced dead at the scene. 27 died from their wounds at the hospital. The Clark County Coroner's Office determined that all 58 victims did die as a result of gunshot wounds. Nowadays, there are 2 additional deaths attributed to this incident for people who died in the years since of complications of their injuries. Approximately 867 people were injured, at least 413 of them with gunshot wounds or shrapnel injuries. Now, Sunrise Hospital, which is 5 miles away, treated the largest portion of the wounded, 199 patients, 150 of whom arrived within a 40-minute window. So one of the trauma nurses at Sunrise Hospital, Renee, said that she followed the trail of blood from the parking lot into the hospital as she came in for work. Wild. So the morning after the shooting, lines to donate blood in Las Vegas stretched for blocks, and wait times were as much as 6 hours or more. In Vegas alone, 800 units of blood were donated to the local blood bank in the days following the shooting, and the American Red Cross reported a 53% increase in blood donations in the 2 days after the incident. And this is an example of what you will always find after something really, really, really bad happens. We know how first responders are going to react, right? It's the job that we've trained for, even if you don't expect to walk into work one day and for an incident of mass violence to happen in your town. But it's always there in the back of your head, I think. Like, is today going to be the day? Is this going to be the next place that's on the news? And I think the first responder stories must be told, because there's doing your job, and then I think there's going above and beyond for people. But I love to share things like all the people donating blood in Vegas, because I love to share what the community does and how it comes together. We're seeing it all over social media right now when it comes to the impacts of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, just neighbors stepping up to help neighbors. And again, I think there has to be some sort of a counter to all the bad that we're always seeing on social media and on the news. We have to tell the stories of the good too. And that's what I hope this podcast can be. So to talk about the Las Vegas incident, I was lucky enough to talk with Aubrey Underwood, one of the emergency dispatchers who was working the night of the shooting. She had just 2 hours left in her 2 p.m. to midnight shift. Aubrey, welcome to the Resilient Responder.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about working that night and the role that you played. How did it all start?
So I remember it was just a normal day, and at 10 o'clock, 10:02, my coworker sitting across from me had said, "There's a shooting at Mandalay Bay," and I looked at her and I was like, "You're lying. No, there's not." And then I ended up getting an Metro Police Department calling in, and they had confirmed there's an active shooter. We've got multiple patients down. This is where we need you to stage. And that was when I had realized, oh, this is real. And then I could see the whole call screen just light up of 911 calls. And that was when it was like, okay, this is happening right now. um,
Absolutely. Yes. And in a dispatch center, there's a lot of jobs that have to be done. There's people fulfilling different roles, especially in an incident that big. So what role did you have that night? Like, what was your job? What were you doing?
So that night I just had an open line with the police department. So we're the secondary PSAP. So the Metro Police Department is our primary. So they were the ones taking the initial calls. And because there were so many coming in, they weren't able to transfer everybody to us. So that's why I had the open line with them. So that way they could say, okay, we have victims here. We have people hiding in this dumpster near this area of the concert venue. And we need you guys to stage here. We think that the shooter's over here and whatnot. And so my role was just updating and putting in multiple calls of where these victims were, and to set up sending in help for them.
Absolutely. And you and I talked about before, and I wrote a little bit about in what I read earlier in the episode about the way that it happened. And of course, we now know there was one shooter at the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay, but because of the geography and because of people running, like they thought there were shooters in the hotels because people ran in. The shooter shot at the airport nearby. So they shut down the airport. They thought there was a shooter there. So it was just chaos as people were trying to figure out what is actually happening. And I mentioned earlier in the episode that about half of the injured arrived to hospitals via ambulance, and the other half arrived from civilians in Ubers, in the back of pickup trucks. Tell me a little bit about sort of your role there and talking to people and trying to help them get people to hospitals.
And so, like I said, I didn't get to talk to any civilians. I just had that open line, but listening to my coworkers, they took the calls from, the civilians. And so they would call in and say, I have 6 people in the back of my truck. Can you guys meet us at this intersection? And they would have to say, if you have people there and you're able to drive, go yourself. What are the injuries? I can tell you how to stop the bleeding and whatnot, and to help them while you're on the way to the hospital. But at this point, ambulances are limited, right? So if you guys have these people, take them yourselves, run, do whatever you can to get help. And just make your way there. And then even for people that weren't injured or just kind of trampled, but not, shot or anything, like, where do we go? Okay, you just run towards this area, go somewhere else. Don't stop running, and go find safety. And if you come across anybody that needs help, you can give us a call. We could tell you how to stop the bleeding and help them. But we're doing the best that we can to send the ambulances to you.
Absolutely. So as I said, the incident happened about 2 hours before you were supposed to get off from work. You obviously did not get off work on time.
I know.
But when did you sort of realize sort of the scale of what had happened? I think first responders, even if people haven't worked an incident of this magnitude, we all can sort of understand that feeling where you're on a call and whatever's happening is big enough or requires enough of you that everything else just sort of falls away and you get that tunnel vision. You're just dealing with what's in front of you, this problem, this problem, this problem. And then all of a sudden you're cleaning up, the incident's over, everybody's okay. And you sort of like your tunnel vision goes away and you're like, oh, right, I was hungry before, or like my phone was ringing, I should answer that. For you, when did you sort of realize the scale of this and how big what you had been a part of actually was?
So like you said, I did not get off on time. I actually stayed until about 2 a.m. And that was when things kind of calmed down a little bit. And at that point, it was just kind of search and rescue for people in the venue. So when I realized how big this event was probably when I got home that night. My husband was waiting for me and he had the news on, and it was just kind of like, whoa. And there were, even that night, I would scroll through Facebook, and there was even the thing from Facebook that was like, mark yourself safe from the shooting. And I was like, okay, there's one sign of this is of great magnitude.
Wow.
And then people uploading videos and seeing the crowd in those videos of just running. And that was when I was like, okay, yeah, this was thousands of people here. And at that point, we, weren't really sure how many were killed or injured and all of that. And so it was later that night and the next day, and kind of just trying to research and whatnot, was when it hit me of this was huge.
Huge, right. Who did you lean on after this? What did you find to be helpful for you?
Definitely my husband. He's a firefighter paramedic, so he's hasn't been involved in something like that, but he knows what that feels like. He was a great support system for me, my family. I also have first responders in my family, and my coworkers. Everybody, everyone knows who was there that night, and we had a lot of peer support come in the next day or even that week. And just everyone trying to talk to us. But it was my coworkers and my family and husband that I really leaned on as far as if I needed to talk to somebody. I knew that if I had certain feelings, I could talk to my coworkers because they knew exactly what I was feeling. And then anything a little bit deeper or something hits me at home, my husband was definitely there to help me through that as well.
Awesome. And, when you and I were talking about this before, you said something really interesting about how I think we were talking about anniversaries and how they can be triggering, challenging, upsetting, whatever it is. And sometimes people handle them differently. Sometimes people really want to be working on that day or really don't want to be working on that day. Any reaction is okay. But I thought it was really interesting when you said, for you try to stay off social media because that is such a reminder and such a visual example of what happened. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. When the day comes around, the couple days before, I don't really feel a lot. It's more like, okay, I know it's coming, and I've dealt with it through avoidance a little bit, I guess. And so that's just kind of what helps me be able to push through easier. And so specifically on that day, I stay off of social media because a lot of people post, the good side of it. And I have friends on Facebook with a lot of survivors and people that were there. And it's just knowing what comes after those happy pictures. I don't like to really resonate with it. And so I just kind of avoid it because I don't want to relive those feelings and feeling like at sometimes feeling helpless because people are calling you and you're like, we're doing the best that we can. And there's not a lot that we can do. We're sending everything that we can, but you guys got to help yourselves at the same time. And so I just don't really like to resonate in those feelings. So I just avoid it.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's avoiding. I think it sounds smart to me. Like I think one of the hard parts sometimes with trauma recovery is you don't know where a trigger or something is going to be. Is it going to be like a smell or a sound or something like that? I've worked through my own sort of navigating of those feelings, and a lot of the first responders I've worked with have as well. But I think for you, okay, seeing those pictures is not helpful for me. So I am going to do what's best for me and set myself up for success and not go where I know that trigger, maybe that's too strong of a word, but that memory or that reminder is going to be. So I don't know if it's avoidance. I think it sounds smart to me.
Oh, I've never thought it that way.
Well, thank you for sharing with us, Aubrey. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
So Aubrey talked about leaning on her coworkers and being around people who had experienced the incident in the way that she had was really helpful to her. And that peer support element is so important. There's a reason that it's as popular as it is. And I want to highlight a course that I wrote on onthejobanoff.com. It's online. You can take it right now. It's called How to Support Your Fellow First Responder. And I wrote it for the person who wants to know what kind of help is helpful in these situations and in just your everyday sort of wanting to be a good friend and be a coworker and know how to check up on the people that you work with. It's like I said earlier, for my dispatchers, I have an entire course menu specific for you, so you don't have fire or EMS examples. I spent a lot of time learning so much about your job so I could write courses that were really relevant and relatable and therefore more helpful for you. For my EMS friends, I have an entire course menu specific for you too. I've been an EMT for almost as long as I've been a firefighter, and so I had to, of course, make sure that you were taken care of. Fire, I've got you, of course. Law enforcement, I want to have a full course menu up for you. It'd be done right now if I could just have some more hours in the day, but I am working on it. You are not forgotten. All right, so as we come into our close, I want to introduce 3 books that we're going to be talking about a lot here at the Resilient Responder podcast. The first book, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to see me hold these books up, is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. Every time I do an interview and I'm asked, like, what book would you recommend? Mine, of course, I have to say that after trauma. But I always say The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. If you read one book this year, read The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. Like I said, we're going to talk about this book in more detail as we go, but this is probably the most impactful book I've ever read. It's a book that sits on my desk every day that I pick up whenever I feel like I could use a bit of encouragement or a bit of perspective. And I will read you one little quote, 2 lines from the preface of the book. The preface is this good. You can imagine how good the rest of the book is. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. What does that mean? What are you talking about, Ali? We'll get into it. Read The Obstacle's Way. Book number 2, we're going to talk a lot about, is a book called Unfuck Your Brain by Dr. Faith Harper. It's a beautiful yellow cover, a little book. You can see all my tabs at the top. This is the best book I've ever read on practical trauma recovery. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see me sitting in front of a giant bookshelf in my office. There's a lot of books on there. I spent a lot of time, like I said, reading about trauma recovery, let alone writing about it. And this is the best book that I've ever read. I recommend it to everybody. I quote it in every course I teach. Unfuck Your Brain by Dr. Faith Harper. We're going to talk a lot about what she has to say about helping ourselves in the first 30 days after a bad call. As a crisis counselor, that's my sort of educational and experiential sweet spot. That's where I can help you, is those first 30 days. And so I really love what Dr. Faith Harper has to say. And so we're going to come back to this book in the future. And then finally, After Trauma, a book written by me. I wrote this for first responders, for trauma survivors. It sort of follows like a 10 to 15 year span of my life and my own trauma recovery, while also including stories of people who overcame trauma as well. I love this book. I'm really proud of it. And we're going to talk about it more in the future as it's relevant to you. All right. So I want to leave you with this thought. If you knew that in 30 days from now, you were going to run a really bad call or have some challenging life adversity pop up 30 days from today, what would you start doing and what would you stop doing to better prepare yourself to meet that stressor? What would you start doing and what would you stop doing right now today? If you knew that a month from now something hard was going to happen, how would you adapt your life now to better meet that stressor? Think about it. Thanks for listening.